For 3 days before the landing, 5 American battleships stood off the little coral island of Peleliu and hammered it with the heaviest guns in the fleet. The Pennsylvania, the Maryland, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, and the Idaho fired until the smoke stood over the island in pillars visible for miles, and cruisers and destroyers worked the shoreline behind them. Aircraft came in wave after wave. On the morning of the 15th of September, 1944, the officer commanding that bombardment, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, sent word that he had run out of profitable targets on the island. He believed it. From the sea, it looked entirely true. Nothing on Peleliu was firing back. Not one gun had replied to 3 days of shelling. Not one battery had revealed itself. And to the men watching through binoculars from the transports, it seemed obvious that the defenders had been pulverized where they stood. Underneath the rock, close to 11,000 Japanese soldiers sat in 500 caves and waited, almost entirely untouched. They had not fired because they had been ordered not to fire. Their commander had spent months teaching them that the first rule of the coming battle was to reveal nothing, and they had held to it through 3 days of the heaviest naval gunfire in the Pacific War. The silence that convinced the Americans the island was dead was the first move of the most sophisticated defensive plan Japan ever built. 73 days later, almost every one of those 11,000 men was dead. Not captured, not withdrawn, not evacuated. Dead, most of them inside the very caves they had spent the summer digging. The perfect trap they had built worked exactly as designed, and it killed the Americans in numbers that shocked a nation, and it still ended with an entire garrison buried inside its own fortress. This is the story of how the finest defense the Japanese army ever devised became the largest tomb it ever dug. To understand what happened on Peleliu, you have to understand what the Japanese had learned by the autumn of 1944, and what it had cost them to learn it. Across nearly 3 years of island fighting, they had defended their possessions in essentially the same way, and every time the results had been the same. The old doctrine said to defeat the enemy at the water's edge. Guns and troops were concentrated on and behind the invasion beaches, positioned to destroy the landing craft as they came in and to throw the survivors back into the sea. It was a doctrine built for a war of movement against another army, and against the American amphibious machine it was close to suicide. Everything sighted near the beach could be seen from the sea, and everything that could be seen from the sea could be destroyed by naval gunfire before a single Marine came ashore. Then, when the beach defense failed, as it always did, the survivors would gather in the dark and make the banzai charge. Hundreds or thousands of men would rise up and run at the American lines with rifles and bayonets and swords in a final act of defiance that ended their honor cleanly. To Japanese officers, it was a warrior's death. To American commanders, it was a gift, because it took an enemy who might have fought from cover for weeks and delivered him in the open at night into interlocking machine gun fire. Islands that could have cost thousands of casualties were finished off in a single evening because the garrison chose to charge. Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, the Marshalls. Again and again, Japan spent whole divisions this way and gained days where it needed months. By the middle of 1944, with American forces closing on the Philippines and the home islands themselves coming within reach of bombers, the Imperial General Headquarters finally accepted that the method was not working and that something else had to be tried. The arithmetic behind that decision was bleak, and everyone involved knew it. Japan had lost the initiative completely. Its navy had been shattered, its merchant shipping was being sunk faster than it could be replaced, and its garrisons on scattered islands could no longer be reinforced or evacuated. There was no longer any realistic path to victory in the field. What remained was a hope, and the hope was political rather than military. If every island cost the Americans enough blood, perhaps the American public would eventually decide that finishing the war by invasion was not worth the price, and perhaps Japan could then negotiate an end short of unconditional surrender. That was the whole strategy. Not to win, and not even really to survive, but to make the war unbearable to the other side. Every garrison sent to a doomed island from that point onward was being spent deliberately, as ammunition is spent, in the hope of shifting the will of a nation 10,000 kilometers away. But the annihilation of Peleliu's garrison did not begin on the beach. It begins in a study room in Japan, where officers who had run out of ways to win the war sat down to design a better way of losing it. What they produced was a genuine piece of military thinking, and it deserves to be described properly rather than sneered at. The new doctrine was called fukaku, which translates roughly as the endurance engagement, and its logic was cold and clear. Japan could no longer hope to defeat an American landing. It could only make each landing so expensive that the American public would tire of paying the price. The purpose of an island garrison was no longer to win. It was to kill as many Americans as possible over as long a period as possible before dying. Everything followed from that. The beaches would no longer be defended in strength, because troops on a beach were merely targets for the fleet. Instead, the shoreline would be covered by pre-registered artillery and machine gun positions dug into high ground further inland, sighted to sweep the sand without being visible from the sea. Let the enemy land. Let him come inland. Then bleed him. The banzai charge was formally abandoned. This was the hardest part of the change, because it cut against a warrior culture that treated the final charge as the honorable end. New orders were explicit. Soldiers were not to throw their lives away in mass attacks. They were to hold their positions, fight from cover, and make the enemy come to them, one cave at a time. A soldier who died taking 3 or 4 Americans with him from inside a tunnel was worth 10 who died running across open ground in the dark. And above all, the defense would go underground. Where the terrain allowed it, garrisons would burrow into hills and ridges, connecting fighting positions with tunnels so that men could move unseen, reoccupy positions the Americans thought they had cleared, and survive bombardments that would obliterate anything on the surface. The island itself would become the fortification. It is worth being clear about what that doctrine asked of the men who had to carry it out. Under the old way, a garrison fought, failed, charged, and died in a night. Under the new way, a garrison was expected to fight for weeks or months from inside the ground, in the dark, without resupply, without medical evacuation, and without the smallest possibility of relief or rescue. The plan contained no provision whatever for anyone coming home. Survival was not part of it. The men were told, in effect, to take as long as possible about dying and to charge the enemy as much as they could for every day of it. Japanese officers who studied the results of the earlier battles were not fools and not fanatics. They were professionals looking at a hopeless strategic position and asking what could still be done with the resources they had. The answer they arrived at was logical. It was also, in a way that becomes clearer the longer you look at it, a formal decision to bury their own army one island at a time. Peleliu was where this new doctrine got its first full-scale test, and the man chosen to run that test was extremely good at his job. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the 14th Division, a formation with a fine reputation that had been brought down from Manchuria, where it had spent years watching the Soviet border, and delivered to the palace in the spring of 1944. These were not second-line troops. They were considered among the best soldiers in the Japanese army. Nakagawa had a little over 10,000 men under his command on the island. Around 6,500 were army troops. Roughly 4,000 more were naval personnel, of whom perhaps 1,500 of the base guard force were trained to fight as infantry, the rest being ground crew, maintenance men and support staff. Behind them was a large body of Korean and Okinawan labourers, brought to the island to do the digging, whose presence matters a great deal to how this story ends. There was an oddity in the command arrangement that says something about the Japanese army. Nakagawa was only a colonel, and the navy units on the island were commanded by officers who outranked him and disliked taking orders from an army colonel. To resolve the friction, a major general named Kenjiro Murai was sent down to Peleliu from the divisional headquarters. Murai did not take command. He was there essentially to lend his rank to Nakagawa's authority, and by all accounts he left the running of the defence to the colonel and supported him. The overall commander of the Palaus, Lieutenant General Sadai Inoue, remained on the larger island of Babeldaub to the north. The Americans, for their part, had gone to Peleliu for reasons that seemed sound at the time and looked thinner every year afterward. The operation was called Stalemate 2, and it was aimed at the Palau Islands as a whole. The Joint Chiefs wanted the deep lagoon at Ulithi as a fleet anchorage for the coming assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and they wanted the flat ground on Angawa for a bomber strip. Above all, they wanted the airfield on Peleliu itself, on the reasoning that Japanese aircraft based there could threaten the flank of the coming invasion of the Philippines. Not everyone agreed. Admiral Halsey, whose fleet had been raiding the region and had found Japanese air power in the palace far weaker than expected, recommended before the landings that the whole operation be cancelled and the islands bypassed. He was overruled, largely because the machinery of a major amphibious operation was already in motion, and the invasion of the Philippines was tied to its timetable. The Marines went in anyway, against an objective that one of the most aggressive admirals in the United States Navy had already judged unnecessary. What Nakagawa built on Peleliu in the months before the invasion was, in the assessment of an American general who later walked through it, the most highly developed fortified system yet encountered anywhere in the Pacific. It was centered on a feature that American planners had barely noticed, because from the air it was covered in jungle scrub and looked like nothing at all. The maps called it the Umurbrogol. It was a spine of ancient coral limestone running up the middle of the island, and it was not a hill in any ordinary sense. It was a chaos of razor-backed ridges, sheer coral faces, sinkholes and steep-sided valleys, all of it jagged enough to shred boot leather and uniforms, with almost no soil to dig in and no cover from the sun. And it was riddled with caves. Something like 500 natural caverns ran through that limestone, and generations of phosphate mining had added a network of man-made shafts and galleries to them. Nakagawa's engineers and mining specialists turned that maze into a fortress. Caves were enlarged, connected by tunnels, and fitted out with multiple levels and separate entrances so that a position could not be sealed by blocking one hole. Many were given sliding steel doors, armoured and rolled shut after each shot, so that a gun could fire and then vanish behind steel before the Americans could reply. Entrances were cut at angles rather than straight in, specifically so that a grenade thrown inside would not reach the men, and so that a stream of flame from a flamethrower would splash against a wall instead of washing down the corridor. The positions were laid out to support one another. Each cave mouth was covered by the fire of others, so that any American approaching one of them came under fire from 2 or 3 more he could not see. Artillery and mortars were registered in advance on the beaches, on the airfield, and on every approach route, which meant the Japanese did not need to see their targets to hit them accurately. One American who saw the finished work described the ridge as a great unsinkable warship, and the comparison is a fair one. It was a warship made of rock, with hundreds of gun ports and a crew of 11,000. The Americans had almost no idea any of it was there. Aerial photographs of the Umurbrogol showed a low, scrubby, jungle-covered rise, and the interpreters reading those photographs recorded it as gently rolling ground of no particular significance. The vegetation hid the shape of the ridges completely, and it hid the cave mouths entirely. The maps issued to the assault battalions showed a feature that did not resemble the thing the men would actually have to climb. That failure of intelligence had a second and worse consequence. Because nobody knew the cave system existed, nobody planned for it. The naval bombardment was designed to smash surface installations and beach defences, and it was allotted 3 days, which was thought generous. Against limestone caverns with multiple entrances and dozens of feet of rock overhead, 3 days of shelling was close to meaningless. The guns tore up the scrub, blew apart a few visible structures, and left the garrison essentially intact and waiting underneath. There was one more thing the planners got wrong, and it concerned the enemy's mind rather than his fortifications. Every previous island had ended with a banzai charge, and American commanders had come to expect it as the natural conclusion of these operations, the moment when the enemy obligingly destroyed himself. The entire estimate of how long Peleliu would take rested quietly on that assumption. Nobody at the top had understood that the Japanese had stopped doing it. The last element of the plan was the one that fooled Oldendorf: absolute fire discipline. Nothing was to reveal itself during the pre-invasion bombardment, no matter what. Guns stayed silent behind their steel doors while the battleships worked the island over for 3 days. Men stayed underground while the shells came down. The whole garrison accepted being bombarded without reply, which requires a kind of discipline that is difficult to overstate, and the result was that the Americans came ashore believing they were walking onto a corpse. Think about what those 3 days were like inside the rock. Battleship shells weighing more than half a ton each came down on the ridges above them continuously, shaking the limestone, filling the tunnels with dust, collapsing the occasional passage. Men sat in the dark and absorbed it, hour after hour, knowing that a single gun firing back would give away a position that had taken months to build. Some of them died in those 3 days without ever seeing the enemy. The others waited and did not shoot, and thereby handed their commander the surprise he had planned for. Nakagawa also did something with his artillery that most defenders never managed. He kept it. Because his guns were inside caves behind steel doors, they survived the bombardment almost intact, and because they had been surveyed in advance onto the beaches and the airfield, they did not need line of sight to be accurate. It meant that on the morning of the landing, the Japanese possessed something no island garrison in the Central Pacific had really possessed before, which was a functioning artillery arm at the moment the enemy arrived. They were not. They were walking into the mouth of the most carefully designed killing ground the Pacific War had yet produced, and for the first hours everything went exactly the way Nakagawa had drawn it. The landing came at 8:30 in the morning on the 15th of September. 3 regiments of the 1st Marine Division going ashore abreast on the beaches at the southwest corner of the island. These were veterans. The division had fought at Guadalcanal and at Cape Gloucester, and considered itself, with some justification, the finest amphibious force in the world. Many of the men had breakfasted on steak and eggs, which was the traditional meal before a landing, and had been told the operation would be short. They had reason to feel confident, and that confidence is part of why what followed hit so hard. This division had beaten the Japanese at Guadalcanal in the first American offensive of the Pacific War, and had ground through the jungles of New Britain afterward. Its regiments were full of men who had already survived things most soldiers never see. They knew how the Japanese fought, or believed they did, and everything in their experience said that an island this small, after a bombardment this heavy, would be a matter of days. What none of them knew was that the enemy had changed the rules while they were not looking. Every hard-won lesson the division carried ashore that morning had been drawn from battles fought under the old doctrine, against an enemy who defended the beach and then charged. The men wading in through the surf at Peleliu were, without any way of knowing it, the first American troops to meet the new Japanese army, the one that had decided to stop attacking and start enduring. The moment the landing craft crossed the line of the reef, the silent island came alive. The pre-registered guns opened from the high ground, firing on coordinates worked out weeks earlier, and the sea around the amphibious tractors filled with shell splashes. Machine guns sighted in the flanking coral heads fired straight down the length of the beaches. Mortars walked along the sand. The first waves came ashore into fire that had been calculated in advance, from weapons that could not be seen. Japanese gunners had even driven stakes into the reef and the sand beforehand as range markers, so that the shooting was accurate from the opening round. The amphibious tractors carrying the Marines had to cross a wide coral reef to reach the beach, which meant a long, slow, exposed run through water they could not leave. Dozens of them were hit on the way in. Some burned on the reef with their men aboard. Others were knocked out at the waterline, so that the beaches filled with wrecked vehicles, even as more waves came in behind them, and units arrived scrambled and mixed together under fire. The northern end of the landing area was the worst of it. There the beach was overlooked by a coral outcrop. The Marines came to call the Point, a low mass of rock honeycombed with firing positions and holding a heavy gun sighted to sweep the entire length of the sand. A single reinforced Marine company assaulted it directly, climbing the rock face and destroying the positions one by one at very close range, and took it. Holding it afterward cost even more, because the Japanese counterattacked it repeatedly for days. Of the company that took the point, only a small fraction was still standing when relief finally arrived. By that first evening, the shape of the whole battle was already visible to anyone willing to look. The enemy had given up the water's edge and was fighting from ground he had prepared for months. The bombardment had achieved little, and the defenders were dying in place rather than charging, which meant that every position would have to be taken by men on foot. By nightfall on the first day, the Marines held a shallow strip of the island and had lost something between 1,100 and 1,300 men. They had also learned, in the space of a few hours, that every assumption behind the plan was wrong. The bombardment had not destroyed the defences. The defenders were not disorganized, and they were not, as it turned out, going to make things easy by charging. Nakagawa did throw one counterattack in on the first afternoon, sending a force of infantry supported by his light tanks down across the airfield toward the American line. It was broken up badly by Marine tanks, anti-tank guns, and aircraft, and it cost him most of his armour and a good part of one of his 5 infantry battalions. It was the closest thing to an old-style attack he ever mounted, and after it failed, he did not repeat the mistake. From that point on, he fought the battle he had planned to fight, which was to make the Americans come and dig him out. Crossing that airfield to reach the ridges beyond it became one of the most feared assignments of the campaign. The strip was wide, flat, and completely open, and every inch of it was covered by guns on the high ground to the north. Men had to sprint across it in the open with mortar rounds walking behind them, and those who made it to the far side arrived scattered, exhausted, and already short of numbers. On the second day, the Marines took the airfield, which was the entire strategic point of the operation, and the fact that they took it so quickly tells you something important. Nakagawa was never trying to hold the airfield. He had given it up in advance, deliberately, because he knew he could not keep it, and because the flat ground around it was exactly where American firepower would be strongest. What he intended to hold was the high ground behind it, and from that high ground his guns could make the airfield a dangerous place to use for weeks to come. Then the Marines turned north toward the ridges, and the real battle began. That is where the first half of this story ends, with an American division that had expected a short fight standing at the foot of a mountain that had been hollowed out to receive it. It took 8 hours to get every name and number in this story right, because the version of Peleliu that circulates online is mostly about an American general's boast, and the far more interesting story is what happened to the 11,000 men on the other side. If this is the history you want more of, hit like. One like. Nothing more. Thank you. What the Marines walked into in the Umurbrogol was unlike anything in their experience, and the men who survived it spent the rest of their lives struggling to describe it to people who had not been there. There was no line to advance against, no trench to take, no defended village to clear. There was a mountain of broken coral, blindingly white in the sun, cut into ridges and ravines so steep that men had to climb using both hands, with the enemy inside the rock rather than on it. The heat made it worse than almost anywhere else in the Pacific. Temperatures on the bare coral ran past 115 degrees, with no shade anywhere on the ridges and no fresh water on the island at all. Water had to be carried up by hand in cans, and some of the first shipments arrived contaminated with oil residue from the drums they had been stored in, so that men who were dying of thirst vomited it back up. Foxholes could not be dug, because there was nothing to dig into. Men built little walls of coral chunks and lay behind them, and the enemy could not be found. A marine unit would take a ridge at heavy cost, consolidate on the crest, and discover that night that Japanese soldiers had come back up through the tunnel system into positions behind them, in caves that had supposedly been cleared. Fire came from directions that made no sense. Snipers shot from openings in cliff faces that were invisible from 20 feet away. The Japanese moved underground and appeared above ground, and every yard of the ridge had to be taken more than once. The cost fell hardest on the 1st Marine Regiment, commanded by Colonel Louis Puller, the most famous fighting officer in the Corps. Puller drove his men straight at the southern nose of the ridge complex, frontally, again and again, and the regiment was destroyed doing it. In roughly 200 hours of fighting, the 1st Marines suffered 1,672 casualties. In one battalion, the casualty rate reached 71%, and when it was finally pulled out of the line, there were 74 men left standing from what had been 9 rifle companies. Among the men fighting on those ridges was a young mortarman in the 5th Marines named Eugene Sledge, who would later write the finest American memoir of the Pacific War. His account of Peleliu is not a story of heroics. It is a record of heat and thirst and terror, and the slow brutalizing of decent young men, of corpses left in the open because nobody could reach them, and of the particular horror of fighting an enemy who was under your feet. Anyone who wants to understand what that mountain did to the men who took it should read what he wrote about it. The Japanese in the caves left a smaller record, for the obvious reason that almost none of them survived to write one. What does survive comes from captured diaries and from the handful of prisoners, and it describes the other side of the same weeks. Men underground listening to the Americans working above them. Water running out. The wounded lying in the dark in passages that stank of death. Officers reading out instructions to hold on and inflict casualties. To a garrison that already understood there would be no relief and no way off the island. There is no reason to romanticize any of this, and no reason to dehumanize it either. On both sides of that rock were young men in an appalling situation, doing what they had been ordered to do by commanders far away. In heat, that would have been intolerable without a war going on. The difference was that the Americans, however terrible their losses, would eventually be taken off the island. The Japanese had been told from the outset that they would not. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is the American answer to the cave fortress, the end of Colonel Nakagawa, and the Japanese soldiers who kept fighting on Peleliu until 1947. Do not go anywhere. The American answer, when it finally came together, was not a better assault. It was a different kind of operation entirely, and it is the reason this battle ended the way it did. Instead of storming the ridges, the Americans decided to treat the Umurbrogol as an object to be dismantled. The pocket was surrounded and sealed off so that nothing could get in or out. Then, position by position, the cave system was destroyed with its occupants inside it. The tools for this work were fire and explosive. Infantry flamethrower teams worked forward under covering fire to put a stream of burning fuel through a cave mouth. Engineers followed with satchel charges and bulk explosive to blow the entrance in behind it. Bulldozers pushed rock and rubble over openings and sealed them permanently. The most effective weapon of all was the flamethrower mounted on an amphibious tractor. These vehicles could carry far more fuel than a man could and throw it much further, and they could be driven right up to a cave mouth behind their own armor. They were, in the plainest terms, machines for filling a sealed space with fire. Their crews worked their way along the ridges, burning out one position after another, and the infantry followed behind them to seal what was left. There was also air support of a kind that had never quite been seen before. Marine corsairs flew napalm missions against the ridges from the captured airfield on Peleliu itself, and the target was so close to the runway that the flights lasted only a minute or two. Pilots reportedly did not bother to raise their landing gear on some sorties because they would be landing again before the wheels finished coming up. It was the shortest bombing run of the war, from takeoff to target and back for another load. The engineering effort deserves its own mention because it turned an impossible problem into a solvable one. Army engineers of the 81st Division built a ramp of crushed coral up the sheer face of one of the strongest positions, a feature the Americans called the China Wall, so that tanks and flamethrower vehicles could be driven up to fire directly into caves that had been unreachable. When you cannot climb to the enemy, build a road to him. It was slow, methodical, unglamorous work, and it was what finally broke the pocket. Alongside the Peleliu operation, the same army division had taken the neighboring island of Angkor, where the Japanese garrison was much smaller and the ground much flatter, and had overwhelmed it in about 4 days. The contrast is instructive. Against the same troops, with the same weapons and the same doctrine, an island without a cave fortress fell in less than a week, and an island with one held out for more than 10. The mountain was the difference, and everybody on both sides understood it. The wider campaign did achieve something, and honesty requires including it. Taking the Palaus isolated more than 40,000 Japanese troops on the surrounding islands, cutting them off from the war entirely for its duration. The anchorage at Ulithi became a vast fleet base that supported the operations against Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Those were real gains. Whether they were worth what Peleliu itself cost is a question American officers began asking before the battle was even over, and it has never been satisfactorily answered. By the middle of October, the 1st Marine Division was finished as a fighting force. It had been in the line for 5 weeks and had lost more than 6,700 men killed and wounded, and on the 20th of October, the Army's 81st Infantry Division took over the reduction of the pocket entirely. The soldiers used the same methods the Marines had developed, with more time and more equipment and less haste, and over the following 6 weeks they compressed the Japanese pocket steadily inward. For the men inside the mountain, Those weeks were something close to unimaginable. They were sealed in the dark, in caves that grew hotter as the fighting closed in, short of water and then out of it, short of food and then out of that too. The wounded could not be evacuated because there was nowhere to evacuate them to. Positions were cut off from one another as tunnels collapsed. Men died of thirst and of infection and of wounds that would have been survivable anywhere else. And when the flame came through an entrance, or the charge went off and the roof came down, whole groups of them simply ceased to exist inside the rock. They kept fighting anyway. That is the part that is hardest for a modern audience to absorb, and it should not be waved away with easy talk about fanaticism. These men had been told, by a command they trusted, that the longer they held, the more they served their country, and they were living out that instruction in the dark, in conditions that had nothing whatever to do with glory. Nakagawa maintained radio contact with his superiors throughout, sending regular reports northward as his command was ground down from thousands to hundreds to dozens. On the 24th of November, 1944, he sent his last message. It said that his sword was broken and that he had run out of spears. He reported that he had divided his remaining 56 men into 17 small groups and ordered them to attack the enemy wherever they could find him. Then he burned the colours of his regiment so that they could not be taken, and he and General Murai took their own lives in the command post. Nakagawa was promoted posthumously to Lieutenant General for the defence he had conducted. That night a final group of Japanese soldiers came out of the caves and was destroyed. On the 27th of November, 73 days after the landing that was supposed to take 3, Peleliu was declared secure. The accounting on the Japanese side is one of the starkest in the entire war. Of a garrison of nearly 11,000 men, 10,695 were killed. Roughly 200 were taken prisoner. And of those 200 prisoners, only 19 were Japanese soldiers. All the rest were Korean and Okinawan labourers, men who had been brought to the island to dig the caves, and who had no stake whatever in the empire they died for. The garrison had not been defeated in the ordinary sense. It had been eliminated, almost to the last man, inside its own fortification. The American cost was terrible too, and it has to be said plainly, because it is the proof that the Japanese plan worked. 2,336 Americans were killed, and about 8,450 were wounded. It was the highest casualty rate of any amphibious assault in American history. The 1st Marine Division had to be rebuilt almost from scratch afterward, and it was still refitting when the invasion of Okinawa came the following spring. The medical services took a beating of their own that is rarely mentioned. The corpsmen and surgeons attached to the Marine Division had to work on those ridges under the same fire as everyone else, crawling out onto open coral to reach wounded men, because there was no other way to reach them. Dozens of surgeons and hundreds of hospital corpsmen became casualties, and many of them were killed. Evacuating a wounded man off the Umurbrogol meant carrying him down a ridge face by hand, under fire, and it frequently took more men than it saved. Medals of honor were awarded for actions on that island, and most of them went to men who did not live to receive them. That ratio tells its own story about what kind of fighting it was. There were no dramatic breakthroughs to be won on Peleliu, and no ground to be gained quickly. The acts that earned those decorations were nearly all the same act, repeated by different men in different places, which was to smother a grenade or charge a cave mouth so that the men beside them would live. And then the battle was very nearly forgotten. Peleliu was fought in the same weeks as the invasion of the Philippines and the enormous naval battle of Leyte Gulf, and the newspapers back home were full of MacArthur wading ashore and of a fleet action that decided the Pacific. A brutal 2-month fight for a small coral island did not compete for space. The men who fought it came home to find that almost nobody had heard of it, and the survivors spent decades afterward describing themselves, with some bitterness, as veterans of a battle nobody remembered. So the doctrine worked. Nakagawa did precisely what he had been sent to do. He made the Americans pay a fearful price for a small island. He held out for 73 days instead of 3, and he did it while inflicting far more casualties than he suffered in proportion to his strength. Measured purely as an exercise in tactics, the defense of Peleliu was a masterpiece, and it was studied as one. And it was also a catastrophe beyond repair, which is the whole point of this story. 11,000 trained soldiers, including some of the best infantry Japan possessed, were removed from the war permanently in exchange for 73 days on an island that turned out not to matter very much. The airfield that the whole operation had been fought over was never particularly important to the American advance. Admiral Halsey had recommended before the landings that the palace be bypassed altogether, and history has largely agreed with him. The Philippines were invaded a month after the Peleliu landing, and the invasion would have gone ahead about the same way whether Peleliu had been taken or not. That is what a strategy of endurance actually means when it is followed to its conclusion. It does not win anything, it cannot win anything. It converts an army into a delaying mechanism, and it spends men the way a mine spends coal, and at the end of it there is nothing left except a longer casualty list on both sides. Nakagawa's brilliance bought his country a few weeks, and cost it a regiment of veterans it could never replace, on a rock that the enemy did not really need. Here is how it unfolded, in order. Spring 1944. The Japanese army adopts the endurance doctrine, abandoning beach defense and the banzai charge in favor of underground fighting. Summer 1944. Colonel Nakagawa turns the Umurbrogol Ridge into a fortress of 500 connected caves and orders total fire discipline. The landing, in mid-September 1944. The 1st Marine Division comes ashore after a bombardment that hit almost nothing, and takes over 1,000 casualties before nightfall. Late September and October. The fighting moves into the ridges where the 1st Marine Regiment is destroyed, and the division is eventually relieved by the army. 24th of November. Nakagawa reports that his sword is broken, burns his colours, and takes his own life. 27th of November. Peleliu is declared secure, 73 days after the landing, with the Japanese garrison annihilated. The factors behind that annihilation are worth naming plainly. The first factor was the doctrine itself. The endurance strategy was designed to trade an entire garrison for time, and it achieved exactly that. The men who wrote it knew there would be no survivors, and they wrote it anyway, because they had nothing better left to try. The second factor was the terrain. The Umurbrogol multiplied the strength of the defenders enormously, but it also trapped them. There was no line of retreat from inside a mountain, and once the pocket was sealed, the garrison had nowhere on earth to go. The third factor was the American method. Fire and demolition, applied patiently over weeks, turned the fortress from a shield into a container. The Americans stopped trying to capture the caves and started destroying them, and against that approach, the caves became the worst possible place to be. The fourth factor was the strategic emptiness of the whole thing. Japan spent 11,000 irreplaceable soldiers defending a position whose loss would not have changed the course of the war by a week. Strip away the maps and the casualty counts, and the destruction of Peleliu's garrison comes down to a single reversal worth stating plainly. The Japanese built the most perfect defensive position of the entire Pacific War. It worked exactly as intended, and that is precisely why every man inside it died. The old way of losing an island had killed a garrison in one night of charging. The new way killed the same garrison over 10 weeks in the dark, underground. sealed in by the very rock that was supposed to protect it. They had not found a way to survive. They had found a slower and more expensive way to disappear. There is a second reversal folded inside the first, and it belongs to the men who did the digging. The Korean and Okinawan labourers brought to Peleliu to hollow out the ridge were not soldiers of the Empire and had not chosen any of it. They cut the tunnels and hauled the rock, and then the fighting closed over them, and they died in the passages they had made. Nearly every Japanese prisoner taken on that island was in fact not Japanese at all. The garrison that was praised for fighting to the last man was, in its final accounting, largely a garrison of conscripted workers who never got a vote. The doctrine that was tested on Peleliu did not die there. It was judged a success by the Japanese High Command, and it was applied again on a far larger scale in the 2 battles that followed. At Iwo Jima the following February, General Kuribayashi took the same principles and built an even deeper tunnel system, and the result was the bloodiest battle in the history of the Marine Corps. At Okinawa in the spring, the same approach was applied to an island with a civilian population, and the death toll ran into the hundreds of thousands. Peleliu was the rehearsal for both. That connection matters for how the rest of the war was decided. Every American planner looking ahead to an invasion of the Japanese home islands in 1945 was looking at Peleliu, and then at Iwo Jima, and then at Okinawa, and calculating what the same doctrine would cost when it was applied by millions of defenders on their own soil. The endurance strategy was meant to make America flinch from the price of victory. What it actually did was help convince American leaders that the price of invasion was unthinkable, and to push them toward other ways of ending the war. The island itself has never entirely let go of the battle. The Umurbrogol is still there, still white and jagged under the sun, and it is still full of the war. Unexploded shells, grenades, mortar rounds, and small arms ammunition lie all through the ridges and the jungle below them, and demining teams have been working the island for decades without finishing the job. Rusted tanks sit where they were knocked out. Caves that were sealed in 1944 have never been opened, and the remains of the men inside them are still there. Japanese recovery teams have gone back to the island over the years to look for their dead, and the work is slow and often impossible. Many of the sealed positions cannot be safely reopened, and many of the men inside were killed in ways that left nothing to identify. Families in Japan have spent lifetimes waiting for remains that will never be returned, because the caves that were the finest fortification of the Pacific War turned out to be extremely good at holding what was put into them. The mountain kept them, and it is keeping them still. And there is a final detail to this story that is stranger than anything a writer would dare invent. When Peleliu was declared secure in November of 1944, not quite everyone came out. Deep in the cave system, a Japanese naval lieutenant named Tadamichi Yamaguchi survived with a small group of soldiers and sailors, somewhere between 26 and 34 men in all. They did not surrender. They stayed underground. They stayed for 2.5 years. They lived in the caves, raided the American installations on the island for food and supplies, moved at night, and held their positions long after the last shot of the battle had been fired. The war ended in August of 1945, and they did not believe it or did not accept it, and kept on. They were still there in 1946. They were still there at the beginning of 1947. In April of 1947, 20 months after the surrender of Japan, a former Japanese admiral was brought to Peleliu to convince them. He carried orders from their own military hierarchy, telling them the war was over and instructing them to lay down their arms, and only then did they come out of the ground. Lieutenant Yamaguchi handed over his sword. It was, as far as anyone can determine, the last formal surrender of the Second World War, made on a small coral island in the Pacific, to a war that had been finished for nearly 2 years. Those men had been ordered to endure, and they had endured longer than the empire that gave the order. It is the perfect final image of the doctrine that killed their comrades, and of what happens when men are handed an order that has no ending written into it. Yamaguchi and his men went home to a country that had been rebuilt around them while they sat in the dark. Everyone they had fought beside was dead. The empire they had held that rock for had ceased to exist. Its cities burned, its army disbanded, its government replaced. They had proven the one thing the doctrine was designed to prove, which was that Japanese soldiers would never stop, and proving it had bought their country absolutely nothing at all. 11,000 men were told to hold out as long as humanly possible on a piece of rock that could not be held and did not matter. A handful of them obeyed that instruction so completely that they were still obeying it years after there was anyone left to give it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because every week we tell you how America actually won its war, including the parts where the enemy was brilliant and it made no difference at all, without the myths and without the easy exaggeration. Hit subscribe, then like, so this reaches more people who should know what happened inside that mountain. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one.